Hello everyone, my name is Anup and I am very excited to announce to you this new video series on iOS interview questions. Now, this is a part 2 of the ongoing video series that I have created. So if you haven't actually checked out part 1, I would actually encourage you to do that because it covers about 80 plus questions that are asked in there are most common questions that are asked in iOS interviews, and it covers both Objective-C and Swift, and that's what we're going to be doing in this video series as well. So, without any further ado, let's get started and take a look at our at our questions. So, basically, I've divided these interview questions in a set of about 9 or 10 questions, and each set is basically covered in a video. So, let's take a look at our first set. So our first question in our first set is, what is core data? So core data basically is a framework to manage your app's persistent store. Now core data is used to manage the model layer object in our application. Now you can treat core data as a framework to save, track, modify, and filter data within your iOS apps. However, core data is not a database. Core data uses SQLite as its persistent store, but the framework does more than what database can do. It basically manages your object graphs, keep the track of your changes that you have made, and basically it does many more things, like it applies concurrency, bulk update, and batch update, and all those things. All right, our next question is, how is core data different from SQLite? Well, there's a huge difference between core data and SQLite, because SQLite is a database just like SQL Server or Oracle. Now, core data is an ORM, which is Object Relational Model. And Object Relational Model basically creates a layer between the database and the UI. And it speeds up the process of integration, as you don't need to write any queries or anything. You just work with the ORM and let it handle all the underlying details. All right. Next question related to core data again is, what is a managed object? So managed objects are the objects that are created by your application code to store data. Managed objects can be thought of as a row or record in a relational database table. For each new row to be added, a new managed object must be created to store the data. Now, similarly, retrieving data will return a form of managed object, one for each record matching the defined retrieval criteria. Managed objects are actually instances of NS managed object class, and these objects are contained and maintained by managed object context. Next question related to core data is, what is a persistent store coordinator? So persistent store coordinator is responsible for coordinating access to multiple persistent object stores. Now, as an iPhone app developer, you will never have to directly interact with with the persistent store coordinator. In fact, you rarely need to develop an app that requires more than one persistent object store. When multiple stores are required, the coordinator presents these stores to the upper layer of core data stack as a single store. So you can have like a whole bunch of persistent stores, and core data will take care of combining them and presenting it in a one simple to use API. Now, what is a managed object context? Core data based applications never interact directly with the persistent stores. Instead, the app code interacts with the managed object contained in the managed object context layer for core data stack. The context maintains the status of the object in relation to the underlying data store, and it manages the relationship between managed object defined by the managed object model. All the interactions that go on underlying databases are held temporarily within the context until the context is instructed to save the changes, at which point the changes are passed down through the core data stack and written to the persistent store. And this is the part where it actually performs the batch update, which actually provides a better performant system for dealing with and saving the data within your persistent stores. Now, another question related to core data is what is an abstract entities? So what are abstract entities? So an abstract entity is if an entity is an entity is abstract if you will not create any instance of that entity. So you're not creating any object instances of that entity. So think of these as abstract classes. Abstract classes, you basically do not instantiate them, but you actually use them to inherit and augment some of its functionalities, and then their subclasses gets instantiated. Now, you typically make an entity abstract if you have a number of entities that all represent specializations of a common entity that should not itself be instantiated. For example, let's say you have employee entity that you can define a person as an abstract entity and specify that it's only concrete sub-entities like employee or customer can be instantiated. So your person entity will become abstract entity, and you provide some abstract definitions and some common functionalities into it. By making an entity as abstract, the entity pane of your data model inspector, you are informing core data that it will never be instantiated directly. Now the next question again is related to core data. What are entity inheritance? So entity inheritance works in a similar way as the class inheritance works, and it is useful for the exact same reasons. If you have a whole bunch of entities that are very similar, you can basically factor out the common properties and create a super entity and basically put those common properties in there and call that as a parent entity. Now, rather than specifying some properties, same properties at several level, in different classes, you can basically define them in one class, in one entity. And then all the sub-entities that are inheriting them basically inherit those properties as well. So for example, you might define a person entity again with attributes such as first name and last name. And then sub-entities like employees and customers, which inherit those entities, basically get those first name and last name for free because they are inheriting from that person class or person entity. Now, in most cases, you implement a custom class to correspond to the entity from which classes are representing basically sub-entity also inherit. Now, rather than implementing business logic common to all entities for several different times over, which is not good for coding because you're actually creating a lot of repeated code, you implement them in one place and have them inherit by their subclasses or sub-entities. All right, next question again is related to core data. What are transient attributes? So transient attributes are the properties that you define as a part of your model. But those attributes are not saved to the persistent store as a part of entity instances data. Core data does track these changes that you make to the transient properties, so they are recorded for undo operations. And you can use transient properties for variety of purposes like keeping calculated values or derived values. And transient attributes are very similar to a relational table's computed columns. Now, can you merge multiple data models in core data? The answer is yes. It is possible to have multiple data model files. An NS managed object model class is capable of merging multiple data models into one, and it is one of the most powerful and advanced feature of core data. And this feature actually is one of the other example that actually distinguishes you working rather directly with the SQLite versus core data, because you get this free with core data. Now, again, one more core data related question. What is reflexive relationship in core data? So reflexive relationship is defined as having a destination entity of a relationship being same as source entity. So basically kind of like a cycle. So the destination a relationship is pointing to the same as the source. So it's basically pointing to itself. It's also possible to have multiple relationships of the same type with different names. For example, a person can have a mother and a father, can be a mother and a father, and both relationships are reflexive, so with the only difference being the name of the relationships. All right. How can we do multi-threading with core data? So concurrency is basically is the ability to work with the data on more than one queues at the same time. So if you choose to use concurrency with core data, you also need to consider the application environment. For the most part, AppKit and UIKit are not thread safe. In macOS particularly, Coca binds and controllers are not thread safe. So Coca bindings basically that you have and controllers that you have in macOS are not thread safe. And if you're using these technologies, multi-threading can be complex. Now in core data, the managed object context can be used with two different concurrency patterns. They are defined by NS main queue concurrency type and NS private queue concurrency type. NS main queue concurrency type is specifically used for your application's interface and can only be used on the main thread of the application. Versus on the other hand, the private queue concurrency type configuration creates its own queue upon the initialization and can be used only on that queue. Now, because the queue is private and internal to the NS managed object context instance, it can only be accessed through perform block method and the perform block and wait methods. Now, this is how you actually create it. So let's say create a let mock basically for manage object context is equal to NS manage object context, and you define the concurrency type, whether it be the main concurrency type or private queue concurrency type. The parameter being passed in as a part of initialization determines what kind of NS manage object context is going to be returned, whether it's going to be main or it's going to be private. Now, in general, avoid doing data processing on the main queue and avoid doing those processings that are not related to the user. Data processing can be CPU intensive and it is performed on main queue, and it can result unresponsive user interfaces, which is bad for your app user experience, and sometimes if that happens, your system can terminate your app as well. If your application will be performing such data, then you should such as importing data into the core data from a JSON, create a private queue context and then perform the import on that private queue context. What is NS managed object ID? So this is an identifier, basically forms the basis for uniqueness in core data framework. A managed object ID uniquely identifies the same managed object both between managed object context in a single application and in multiple applications as a distributed systems. Now, identifiers contain the information needed to exactly describe an object in a persistent store, like a primary key in database. Although the detailed information is not exposed, the framework completely encapsulates the external information and presents a clean object-oriented interface. Now, last question for this section. What is NSFetch request? And this is again related to core data. So NSFetch request is the class responsible for fetching objects from core data. Fetch requests are powerful and flexible. You can use fetch request to fetch a set of objects meeting the provided criteria, individual values, and much more. All right. So in the next section, we'll start looking at interview questions set 2. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. I will see you guys in the next video. Thank you.